don't want to lie, but you just made the coolest thing ever inside of Cinema 4D, and now you want to render it, alright? You need to render before you can plaster that bad boy all over the interwebs to get those sick likes, right? So what we're going to be doing today is showing you how you'll be rendering for this class, make some render presets so it'll be nice and seamless as you're rendering projects that I assign to you throughout the class. Alright, so let's go ahead and navigate to our render settings window, and we can bring up the render settings by clicking this little clapper icon with the gear. Here are our render settings, and I'm just going to cover what you need to know to render for this class out of all the settings that are here. So first we'll start with output. This is where you set your width and height, your frame rate, and your range, like your animation render range, okay? So we have all these nice little presets here that you can choose from, but for this class we're only either going to render out at 720p or 1080p, okay? So the lowest quality is this right here, the width and height. And if you wanted to render out at 1080p, which is, higher quality, and I actually recommend that you render out at the highest quality, what we can do is use this lock ratio, and that locks in that 16:9 default ratio that we have here, and I can just change this to 1920, and that'll update the height for me, keeping that 16:9 ratio, alright? So next up is resolution, and you typically never have to touch this unless you end up doing some like print work for magazines or something like that, and then you might want to change the resolution to like 300, but for digital, for the web, we're just going to keep this at 72. You're not going to need to touch it for this course, okay? So just leave that be. Next up is frame rate, and just like with After Effects, you want to make sure that your project frame rate matches your render frame rate because they're not kind of linked as you think they would. So let me just show you how you can navigate to your project frames per second here. So in our attributes menu, there's this mode drop down. We just need to go to project and then go to frames per second. So we have a different frames per second than we do in the frame rate. And by default, it's actually set up to 30 and 30. But if I change this to say 15, that's not going to update our frame rate in our render settings. So we need to make sure we change that. One piece of advice is to have a good idea of what you want to animate at. So if you're working on something super cartoony and you want that little staggered kind of look, make sure you decide that before you lay down any keyframes, because watch what happens as I change the frames per second. The timeline's gonna conform to whatever frame rate you have, and if you've been animating at 30 frames per second and you bring this down to 15, some of your keyframes might get kind of messed up. So have a good idea of what you're going to be animating at, change that in the frames per second project setting, and just make sure you update whatever your project settings are to your render settings. Alright, so I'm just going to leave that at 30, and typically rendering at 30 is going to be fine for this class. And next we have our frame range, and since right now we're just going to be rendering out a still, this current frame is totally fine. So I can, for a still image without any animation, no matter where you drag the playhead here in the timeline, it's going to be exactly the same. So you can see this is updating with the wherever my playhead is, and this is fine. All right. So next up is the save. So we need to save this somewhere. This is where we name our saved file and determine where we want to save it to. All right. So what we'll do is click this little button with the three dots, and you can see I already have a folder here set up with ramen. And what I'll do is just name this ramen and name it still, because this will be a still image. And then next we can choose what image format we want to use. Alright, so we have a whole bunch here. I'm just going to choose PNG, and I actually use PNG sequences for both still and animations. And the reason for that is it's a good balance of image quality and file size. So with PNG we can change the color depth, alright? So we can choose all the way up to 16, which is a good idea to render at least 16 bits. If you're used to working in After Effects and you've ever made a gradient ramp and you see that color banding that happens, what you probably have to do is go to your comp render settings, adjust it to 16 bits, and you'll see that with that double amount of color information, it smooths out all those gradients. So you always probably want to render out at least 16 bits for 3D as well, smooth out all those colors. Next up is alpha channel, and we should all know what an alpha channel is by now, but typically when you render with alpha, you want to make sure it's not pre-multiplied and you actually have a straight alpha, so you can check on straight alpha there, but I'll just keep that off for now. We'll cover compositing project files later in the class, same with multipass, so we're going to skip on ahead to anti-aliasing. Now, anti-aliasing in Cinema 4D is handled differently than After Effects, in that After Effects, usually when you go to render a comp, it defaults to the best anti-aliasing, so you never have to touch it. In Cinema 4D, though, our default anti-aliasing is set to geometry, which is, yeah, you know, it's alright. It's good for previews to see how your animation looks, but it's not good for final quality renders. So for that, and for this class, you want to render with the best anti-aliasing setting, which is aptly named best. So choose best, and that brings up our min and max levels. This is the quality sampling levels. You don't have to touch all this stuff ever, pretty much. But the next biggie is filter. So for Cinema 4D, there's two different, or well, actually there's a few options here for filter, but two of the biggies is this still image and this animation. And the reason why there's a different filter for a still image and for an animation is that this cubic still image is a very sharp edge render, which looks really nice for print or stills, but it's not useful with moving objects. Because of that sharpness, it can create flickering in an animation. So that's why there's this totally different animation filter that smooths out the edges just slightly and prevents all that flickering. And when I actually render all this stuff, we'll go and see what the difference is and see that little bit of difference between the still image and the animation. But for now, we're just setting up the still image, and we'll just set it at that. And that's basically all you need to touch for a still image animation. Alright, so we have this set to render at current frame, which is 83 right now. Now we can go and save a render preset. So what I'm going to do is right click on this little My Render setting here and go to Save Preset, and then you can just name it whatever you want. And I'm just going to name this School of Motion, and the quality, which is, or the resolution, which is 1080, and then just still. And I'll click OK. And then to load that up, I'll just right click in this little area here, go to Load Preset, and you can see I already had one named that, but here it is right there. I'll go and load that up, and then to use that, all I need to do is make sure that the little viewfinder icon is highlighted, and it will use that render preset. Okay, so what I can do now is go ahead and render this. So to render an image, we're going to go and navigate to our render menu, which is this little clapper with a little looks like an interface window. If you click and hold on it, brings up this whole list of stuff. And what we're going to be needing is this render to picture viewer. And you might be asking yourself, what is a picture viewer, and why isn't this just render? Why isn't this just render to computer? So basically, the picture viewer is the conduit where you can view your rendered image as it's being saved to your computer. So kind of like watching your comp view in After Effects as you're seeing the animation kind of render by, okay? So I'm just going to click Render to Picture Viewer, and I already rendered this image before, so I'm just going to say yes to write it over, and you'll see, boom, there is our still image. Now, this is our really nice and handy picture viewer. We can use this navigator to zoom in and kind of get some nice details in there. We can also go and check how long that render time was for that frame. We can check out what frame that number that was, and then the resolution. Alright, so a lot of information that is readily available inside of the picture viewer. So let's just go ahead and let's go back to my render setting here, and let's set this up for animation. Okay, so I have a full 90-second animation in here. We want to render all of those frames. So for animation, I'm going to go to, instead of current frame, I'm going to go to all frames. So that'll render our entire length of our timeline, which is default set to 90. The frame rate's fine. we can save this as something different. So Ramen Anim for animation. And I'm going to keep this at PNG. And the reason for that is rendering's a little bit different from After Effects. Typically, when you hit that big shiny render button in After Effects, you've already done all your compositing. You got your render looking exactly as you want, and you're rendering out that final file, or hopefully final file, and sending that to the client, right? That's the finished product. In Cinema 4D, though, typically you're not quite done yet, right? You're rendering out a raw 3D animation. You always want to bring that into After Effects or some compositing app and at least do some color correction, okay? I want you to get used to doing a little bit of post work. Never just send off a raw rendered image from Cinema 4D, okay? So that's why it's useful for rendering PNGs, is because say you render out your full 90 frames and you see the animation or something looks screwy, or I screwed up something from frames 20 to 40, okay? So then you'd go and you'd render out you'd change this to manual and manually render out frames 20 to 40, okay? And what that would do is, since you rendered out individual images, an image sequence, what it'll do when you render out your 20 to frame 40 is it's going to write over all those other frames. So then once you're in After Effects, all you need to do is right-click on that image sequence and just reload, and it'll update. So, no muss, no fuss, super easy, streamlined workflow. Now, if you did that with a MOV file, the situation would be much different. You'd render out that same sequence, but it'd be a movie file. Then what you need to do is import that movie file into After Effects and then manually line up that little segment of that movie to where you need to match it up to the existing, the older render, okay? So a lot more work, a lot more grunt work doing it that way, so that's why you should always render out PNGs, whether it's a still or an animation, all right? That's my spiel. So next, we changed the save name. Next is that filter, okay? Because this is an animation, we don't want flickering, so we're going to use this Goss animation filter. Aptly named animation for animation, still for still. And that's basically it. So now we can go ahead and with this, we're making all these changes to this My Render setting here. So I'm just going to right click on My Render setting, go to Save Preset, and this will be School of Motion 1080, and this will be Anim for animation. And then I'll hit OK, and then we'll just right click and load that up. And again, you can see I already had one saved, so I'll just load that up. And again, to use it, we need to make sure we're clicking on and making sure that viewfinder is highlighted on that render preset. Okay, so now we're ready to render. I'll close out of this render settings window and go to render to picture viewer. And again, I already rendered this before too, so I'll just write over. And now you'll see that instead of just the still, we're actually seeing the buckets, the little render buckets doing their thing. And you can see how long it's taking for each frame. And as long as we're on this little orange film strip thing, it's actually going to show us each frame as it's rendering. If I click off and say, want to look at frame 8, and just kind of drag the playhead here, I can see how this looks, and I'm like, alright, that's looking pretty good. But to get back to seeing each of those rendered images as they happen, you need to just click on, and this is really fast render, so it's kind of like whack-a-mole. You need to click on, you need to click on the image that has the little orange film strip on there. So now you can actually see this as this is rendering, okay? And then you can kind of view this and play this back by hitting the play button, or if you have a much higher quality or more complicated image that is taking a longer time to render, or just a longer animation as well, we can then almost like cache this or RAM preview this by clicking this little button and turning it yellow, and this will cache all those frames to memory, and I can actually see this animation played back in real time. Alright, so we'll just let this render finish up here, and got 2 more frames to go. There's our frame 90. Alright, so we can click this button and cache all those frames, And once it's done, it'll change from that yellow to this little green with the play. And it's looking pretty dang good. That's an awesome animation. Pat on the back. So let me just quickly show you one last thing, and that's the difference between the animation filter and the still filter that we set up there in the anti-aliasing, okay? So we rendered out frame 83. So let's go to frame 83 using the animation filter. And let's zoom in here, okay? So we'll zoom into, say, 150. Again, I need round numbers, okay? I'm OCD here as well. And what we're going to do is go up to our still 83 using the still filter. Now watch how that kind of sharpens it a bit. Let me do that one more time. So this is the animation filter. See how everything's kind of blurred a little bit? The edges are blurred. And then the still. So that's kind of the difference of those two different filters there. One's good for animation, one's good for stills. Use each one accordingly, okay? So that's how you render out of Cinema 4D, and we'll be using these render settings that we saved, those rendered presets, throughout the class. So this is going to save you a lot of time from manually having to change everything. But that's basically it. Easy stuff, right? All right. So now you're ready to render for this class. So render away, plaster all of your images on the social medias, and happy rendering.